And what we're going to talk to you about today is, like Dorothea already said, is digital traces of human behavior in online platforms. And so Katrin Weller, for those of you who actually attended the last week Meet the Experts session, already gave a good overview of what CSS generally is. And what we want to do today is go more into depth on a bit more into depth into what a typical research design might look like and what typical error sources might be. It's just in the spirit of best practices, what you might want to avoid when you do such a study. And we only do it specifically on online platforms, so no fitness trackers or something like this for today. So that's exactly the steps, the typical design steps, the content points we're going to cover today, the typical design steps in a study with digital traces of human behavior online, and then some typical errors. And we're going to do this on a use case, one study plus some extensions that one could imagine to make it more graspable for you. Before I start with the content, to remind you that this is a series, and also to remind you that sometimes we're going to use digital traces here as a term. Sometimes we say digital behavioral data. This is basically interchangeable for now. We mean digital traces of humans, mostly in online platforms. And next week we're going to have another one on combining survey data and digital behavioral data that can be recorded together. This talk will then go into a summer break. This series will go into a summer break, and we come back in September and have more coverage. I could also recommend you the workshop by Katrin Weller and Indira Sen on Introduction to Social Media as Research Data, which goes basically on a topic that we covered today a bit more into detail, if you're interested in having a workshop on this. And we have a newly composed, but with proven lecturers, fall seminar in computational social science, where several people, external lecturers as well as us, going to offer certain courses if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of doing data science yourself and code a little bit and learn how that works actually with R or with Python. For that you have to go to training.gases.org and be quick there. Often full very quickly. Yeah, so this is the overall idea of what these where we fit in with this talk. And what I want to start you off with is a typical research pipeline with digital trace data. So Katrin last week talked about already what what kind of studies are actually possible overall with these kind of data. And what I want to start you off with is a typical research design that is not unlike what you would do with a survey. So you would actually have a target population that you would like to ask a question about or measure a construct for. So the target population could be, for example, all US adults. And you would like to measure, for example, the approval of Donald Trump as a president or Joe Biden. And what you do in a survey setting is pretty much you would ask a sample, somewhat a small sample of your of people in that target population, a certain amount of questions, right? And of course, there are certain problems with this. We all know this, that have ever done surveys, especially at Gases, we know this. They're costly, they're lagging behind when you have very recent events that you could not know about in beforehand. So you cannot ask about this in retrospect. You usually have very small samples, so that you maximally in the thousands. So that I don't know, and response rates is another thing that you of course have to care about. Now, as early as social media popped up and got more popular, people already, also researchers and marketing people as well, already, of course, jumped to the conclusion that you can now simply use what is in these platforms. So the most common suspects are listed here. You might come up with new ones that might be also popular in certain strata. And it's not that far-fetched actually, because I mean, what you can do, you have users in your target population or people in your target population that are users of those platforms that are actually more numerous than you would ever reach with a survey, with a single survey. So here's the numbers for the US because it's the most complete. So we have 22% of all US adults use Twitter, 69% of all US adults use Facebook, and we have around 260 million unique video visitors, at least in the US, per month on Google. So it's not unlikely that the coverage is actually not that bad. So that is not a completely outlandish idea to have, right? Also, we of course might have to concede that in Germany or in Europe, this is usually it's a little bit lower. Okay, and what we have there, just to get through some terminology, what we call in the framework that we're using here, called users. So users could be accounts, it could be people, it could be a user account on Twitter, but it could also be an IP address, for example, for a specific, when you go to Wikipedia or Google, you don't need an account. It could also be an IP address. That stands for, is a proxy for a person in the target population. And these users produce traces. That's how that's the nomenclature we use here. So that might be all kinds of things. For Twitter, it might be tweets, retweets, likes, and replies. And for Google, a Google search, it might be the query you send, so the search terms you send as a search query, the visits of the websites you're actually going to, or the location that you're at, for example, taken from your IP. And in other systems, these might be very different. But often they have some commonalities. For example, there's text shared or certain links between people. And that's exactly what you can work with. So this kind of setup is often called, just to have this mention this, social sensing. So basically when you use on-platform data to do off-platform inferences. So you use people, users on the platforms as sensors, their proxies on the platform as sensors for what happens in a, for example, offline target population. What you can also do, which is not less, and which might be not so close to survey design, but is a thing that in computational social science is done a lot as well, is you don't take an abstract target population and is, for example, a national population, but you just take the population of the platform and ask questions about that, which could be, what is the susceptibility to fake news of all German-speaking Twitter users? So how does information spread, for example? And that is, it has become more and more also important. The more and more important these systems get for society as a whole, this becomes more and more of a question that we could actually legitimately ask of, like, how does Twitter work and how does Facebook work actually? And these are often called platform studies, just to get the differentiation between those two. And we're going to refer to more of these social sensing in the remainder. So we have the construct that we want to measure, measured through these traces, tangible traces that operationalize our construct, so the digital actions or interactions. And we have the users that are the representations of the humans in our target population. And on online platforms, they're usually accounts, profiles, or IP addresses. But they can also be in other digital forms. They could be, for example, a fitness tracker ID, a cell phone number, or in a survey, they often are actually, for example, telephone records that you use. And where we start from, so what we want to take off from as a pipeline is the total survey error framework, which some or maybe even many of you have heard before from. So the survey error framework is, this is the version that from Groves and colleagues, is it outlines, and I scrapped the errors here actually from this error framework, actually outlines the steps that one goes through in survey methodology to arrive at to make a survey, to design a survey, and then put it into the field, and then do something with the answers. So you have the construct in the measurement part on the left side. The construct is defined, the measurement in terms of the items is designed, the responses are collected in the correct way, and then the responses are cleaned. On the representation side, we actually define the target population, we define a sampling frame, then we sample from that frame, and then we hope that all of our samplees actually respond to our request for answers. And afterwards, we can do survey adjustments, for example, reweighting or post-stratification adjustments. And we arrive at a survey statistic, which could, for example, be the approval of Donald Trump in the US. Now, we're not going too much detail into this, but I want to especially want you to keep in mind the distinction between measurement, which is already on one single survey participant or one single user, that we guarantee that we actually measure what we want to measure, the construct that we want to measure. So with a given instrumentation, we measure what we want to measure, while representation is, given all these answers, do we actually make the right inference to the target population, which is not the same as our sample usually, right? Non-probabilistic surveys for sure, but in digital traces for very sure. So given that is the way we go through a survey pipeline, what we came up with, recently we're working on this for a while now, is a pipeline for digital traces, where you also start with the construct definition, and you already see it's not distinguishing between measurement and representation, because in digital traces this is much entangled actually. So the design steps always have a consequence for both of these things, usually. So construct definition is the first thing, is kind of easily understood, and also you do the target population definition here, but I'm gonna put that in the background a little bit in the remainder, because it's not quite inducing so many errors here. And then the next step is shown already very different. You select a platform instead of actually sampling from somewhere. So select a platform, usually like Twitter or Facebook or something else, and go from there. And then basically say that is the one where I want to measure my construct at for whatever my target population is. The next thing you want to do is to go, if that platform actually has data available for you, which is another step that you have to be careful be aware of. You go and collect that data with usually with specific requests to an API or a database or something like this, or you scrape it from the web. And then next you go to processing, and pre-processing is also more important than in surveys in that so there's a lot of noise, more noise that you would expect in a survey, which is designed, and you would like to augment some of the data that you have there because certain metadata is missing that you would actually need, especially demographics of people, but also you want to structure unstructured data like text. And lastly, you come to an analysis step where you then do the actual model, for example, a regression still to model something, or you also do reweighting, for example, of the people that you have in your sample or in your collection better. Okay, and this is all. This is covered in a paper if you want to look this up that we have written on a survey error framework for digital traces of human behavior. If you want to look this up. And now this was very abstract. Let's start with a use case that we want to use throughout here. So detecting the flu with digital traces. And there was that started off this craze in computational social science, kind of, as Google and the CDC in the US were the first to use large-scale search engine query data to actually detect who has the flu in the US or influenza-like illnesses, to be broader. So that's the question they asked. But of course, many of you are not epidemiologists. I cannot say that word. You're not interested in the spread of epidemics. That question could be in the same way asked and has been asked in many, many different settings as well, for what's the approval rating of a politician, or what's the anti-immigration stance in a specific population, for example. So, but we're using this as an example because it's quite popular, very nice to show what can happen, what can go wrong, and what is really possible with this kind of data. So, and what was the idea here? So the idea, and again, you can do this as well for approval of a politician, or you can do this for sentiment towards immigrants, whatever you like. Google Trends, Google is used by so many people also in a general population that you can actually look at the Google Trends of searches over time, and you can tell something about what's going on in the population, basically in real time. And what these authors did, they said, okay, we're going to look at these search terms, for example, influenza or cough, and there's enough face validity already here, and this is from 2019, that actually shows you that this goes up towards the winter, and many other terms in combination actually provide even better measurements for this, that people search for cough and fever are not unlikely to have influenza-like illnesses. By the way, this doesn't work anymore in 2020 and 2021, but that is basically because of Corona. But it worked pretty well before that, let's say. So what did they do in a nutshell? And Indira will elaborate on this. So they looked at a construct is an influenza-like illness, easy enough, straight enough, and the target population would be national or regional populations in the US. And the platform was, of course, just Google Web Search. And they used logs of searches, so queries that people have entered from 2003 to 2008, weekly, and then they broke down from 50 million search terms to those that predicted best what the actual cases of ILI were. And the preprocessing was that they aggregated this per region, normalized it by the overall search activity, because that might be influenced when people stay at home and search more. You want to normalize this, and then the location was done via IP, which Google has for all searches. And the analysis was basically a regression where we simply looked at the dependent variable was the doctor visits reported by the CDC for these ILIs, and the queries were the independent variable, and it was fitted over roughly 1,100 data points. And this worked great. So since then, we never needed anything else. So this basically had super good concurrent validity. So on the red is the reported ILI cases from the CDC. Yeah, they're only reported for the winter season, and then the black is the Google model. So this query model, and this the correlation with these two curves were very good. The content validity of the search terms that they found, the query terms, also looked great. And did some other validations, and the original paper concluded that this can now be used for forecasting, or nowcasting at least. And what the CDC provides only regional data, and now this can be done on very fine-grained local data, for example, city level, and it can be done in other countries that don't have a CDC, for example. The problem was basically solved until 5 years later, people started noticing that this went kind of off the rails. So the model that Google had made actually started, and please look at the right side, the right gray bars here. Once I have it for the United States, and when I have it for a bigger region, Mid-Atlantic states, it completely started overestimating completely how many flu cases there were, and nobody could really explain why at the time. And before that, so this was already the improved model that Google had made after their paper, and the red line is actually the first model that they had made. And this already had failed in the H1N1 bird flu epidemic in 2009. It completely missed it. Yeah? So, long story short, research afterwards came to the conclusion that this basically was part of a flu detector, but part of it was also just a winter detector, and that it was also kind of a media detector. And the errors were autocorrelated, and even worse, they changed direction and magnitude, changing with seasons. So they were not even uncorrelated from itself from the previous week, for example. So there was huge potential. But there's also, so there is this huge potential for sure, but the core challenge is that these big data are not made for the instruments that they are applied as to measure certain things. So that is always to keep in mind, and to dive into that deeper, we want to dissect the process of what's actually happened here, and that's where Indira will take over.
So far, we've seen how certain design choices, as well as factors that are contained in the data on the platform, can sometimes derail research questions. But we'd like to go deeper into that. And especially taking into account the scaffolding that the total survey error framework provides for surveys, we would like to use that scaffolding for digital traces as well. So we'll start with construct definition. And the idea here is that a person might feel flu-like symptoms such as cough or fever, an issue which has become a sad reality, especially now. And they might go online and generate some traces. So far, Fabian talked to you about the Google flu case, about predicting flu using Google search queries. But one of the great things about the digital trace data revolution is that we have a lot of choice. And people also have a lot of choice about how they wish to leave traces. So a person can search for queries related to the flu on search engines such as Google or Bing. They can search or read up in much more detail about flu on online encyclopedias such as Wikipedia. Or they might go to social media to talk about the fact that they have the flu or issues related to that. So, for this dissection process, we're going to talk about a couple of different platforms, mostly Google and Twitter. And so the idea is that a person feels flu-like symptoms and they generate these traces, and a researcher might think that the presence of these traces are a strong indicator of a person having flu. But one thing to keep in mind is that these traces can also be generated by somebody who's just looking for information without having symptoms themselves. Maybe they have similar symptoms, but it's not exactly the flu, or somebody they know has symptoms, so they just want to read up more about that. On the other hand, these traces might also be generated due to heightened media coverage. A person sees that there's a lot of attention towards a new pandemic, or even in pre pandemic times, to new strains of flu. And they might want to read up more about this for that reason as well. So, traces are generated for reasons other than having the flu itself. And so that's where we run into issues of validity. And as we talked about, there are measurement errors and representation errors. Validity here is a measurement error because the construct that we're interested in, which is the incidence of flu, and the way that we're capturing that, or the way that we're measuring that through our defined measurement, which is traces left on different platforms, might have a mismatch because there are other reasons for leaving these traces. And so the issue of validity is the insufficient linkage between the construct that we have in our minds and the envisioned measurement. The next step of the process is platform selection, and we might think about two platforms that we would like to do the study on. While the Google flu study was done on Google, just to add a little bit more richness to this analysis, we'd also like to talk about Twitter. And so we'll talk about the specific features of these two platforms. So for Google, we get autocorrect or recommendation for search queries, and the algorithm behind that is constantly changing, and we're not really sure of its specifics. And one more thing about Google is that the data that we have on these search queries are much more coarse-grained and available at a low granularity. Whereas if you think about social media sites like Twitter, where there's a lot of data available with much higher granularity, but Twitter also has certain challenges. For example, there's a 280 character limit, which affects how people express themselves. There's also, for example, the trending tweets option. And finally, the API only gives you certain types of data. It doesn't give you viewing data, for example. And so all of these taken together are a particular platform's affordances, and these platform affordances can distort how people behave, and as such, distort our measurement of them. And this is an issue of platform affordances, which is the gap between the true trace that we want to measure, the incidence of flu or trace behavior related to that, and the trace behavior that we end up measuring due to these distortions. The next step, which actually happens during platform selection itself, is choosing a particular population. And this is typically the platform population. For Google, that would be people who have access to Google, and for Twitter, that would be people who have Twitter accounts. More closely, these would be people who access these accounts and engage in health related topics. Um, and while Fabian already mentioned that these platforms are gaining more and more popularity and gaining more usage, they still tend to skew towards a certain demographic. So Twitter especially tends to skew younger, male, Western educated, especially in the US. This is maybe not so much the case for Facebook, but again, Facebook has certain data restrictions. So Twitter is the one that we would go for. And so we have this type of platform skew over here. And that leads to a platform coverage, which is now a representation error. So we've seen measurement errors so far. This is a representation error because we are misrepresenting the target population that we're interested in, which would have been the US population, and using the platform population as a proxy for that. So after platform selection, the next step is data collection. And here for Google Flu, what was done was that they used automated search queries or search queries that were highly correlated with the flu. So one example was that this particular search query that had a high correlation, and they picked 45 such queries without really, just looking at highly correlated queries. Uh, there's a slightly different way of doing this for social media platforms such as Twitter, where we would select data based on keywords, and these would be highly precise so that we can get uh, really relevant data. But unfortunately, that data is oftentimes also leads to some noise. For example, in this case, influenza is for sure an important and relevant keyword. But this person who has tweeted is talking about the influenza vaccine rather than having the flu or influenza themselves. So while this may be obliquely related to the construct, it's still not an indicator that this person has the flu. So these issues are a part of trace selection about the trace that we end up selecting, and these could also again distort our measurement, where the trace selection issues are the gap between the relevant traces that we want and the traces that we end up measuring due to design choices of the researcher. During data collection, another thing that happens either directly or indirectly is user selection. So let's again go back to the search queries. So here are some search queries, and as you can see, the first five are in English, and if you go down the list, these are in Spanish, which are basically the same thing, just translated in Spanish. And so, if you don't take Spanish tweets or Spanish search queries, what happens is that you might be leaving out a certain population which tends to favor Spanish over English. And in US, this is Arizona that's highlighted over here, and there are states in US which have high bilingual populations and high Spanish speakers, and we would end up misrepresenting or underrepresenting this particular group. And this would again be a representation error, a user selection error, which is the difference between the platform population and the users that we end up selecting due to our queries. The next step is data preprocessing, and here one of the interesting things about digital traces is the large scale of data that we typically have. And in with such large scale data, we often do not have demographic information such as location. So, for example, in search queries, we would have to infer that, whereas in a survey, you could directly ask a person for their demographic information. So this is something that we would have to infer. Similarly, on Twitter, we would have to infer their location again, or maybe certain types of demographic characteristics such as gender or age. And this is typically done using machine learning methods because, again, this is large scale data and difficult to hand code. And when we use machine learning methods, they aren't perfect, they have issues, they are often also biased against certain populations. And this is what is typically called a user augmentation issue. Which is that when we wrongly infer the user characteristics, we are again misrepresenting our target population and running into a representation error. And then the final step is data analysis. So Fabian already talked to you a bit about how the final estimate was arrived at in the Google flu case. So I'm not going to talk about the analytic issues over here, but I will talk about one aspect that's gaining traction in digital trace data, which is adjustment. And that's also highly inspired by survey methodology, which is that we have this many number of representation errors, such as coverage error and user selection error. And so one thing that we might want to do is try and correct for some of these errors using adjustment methods like post-stratification. And for that, we would need demographic data, which we inferred in the previous step. And what we might do is pick a few variables that we think are relevant for this adjustment. Um, Unfortunately, if our choice of variables are erroneous, then we might run into issues of adjustment, which are errors due to correcting for representation errors, unfortunately. So that is some of the errors in a nutshell. There are quite a few more due to lack of time. We can't cover them all, and especially since we would like to hear from you and listen to your questions. But our paper is available. It's going to be it's still in press, but it'll be published soon. And so yeah, feel free to, I encourage you to check it out. And thank you for your attention. And now we have a few more points that Fabian will discuss.
Thanks for your attention. So yeah, like Idris said, we can try to keep it at the half-hour mark, but we are of course here now for your questions. What I wanted to mention is that GASES offers also, apart from the things that I mentioned previously in the series here and training, we constantly offer consulting in terms of these issues of CSS studies, on also more concrete issues when it comes to, for example, how can I apply NLP to tweets. So please reach out to us, either to the general consulting contact that's up down here. Oh, I put Katrin's email here conveniently, but you can also, of course, also reach out to individual people at the CSS department. So that's always possible and part of our mission as well. Yeah, you can go to. And there are more services at GASES. So training was already mentioned. We have survey guidelines that the colleagues from the survey methodology department specifically have put a lot of work into. If you're interested in that, there's also more coming from us in terms of guidelines in the hopefully near future on CSS methods and data science methods. We have a blog, a newsletter, and even a podcast. So be aware to check this out. Yeah, think about all these different possibilities. That's it. And now we are looking forward to your questions.